Burkina Faso's bold move has stunned the world. 8,000 soldiers turned into farmers overnight. Why? To fight hunger, not with weapons, but with seeds and soil. In July 2025, President Ibrahim Traoré made an unprecedented decision: disarm the soldiers and send them to the farms. This wasn't a temporary measure, it was a strategic move to combat food insecurity and reclaim Africa's independence from foreign aid. The revolution isn't on the battlefield, it's in the fields. Stay tuned to see how one country is redefining sovereignty and economic independence. On July 1, 2025, a momentous shift occurred in Burkina Faso that would change the way the world viewed both the nation and its future. President Ibrahim Traoré, in a historic and unexpected move, ordered that 8,000 trained soldiers, who had once defended the country's borders, be redeployed to the nation's farmlands. These soldiers, who had been on the front lines of Burkina Faso's many battles, were now to become the country's primary workforce in an effort to combat the severe food insecurity plaguing the nation. This move, which was initially met with skepticism, quickly became one of the most talked about events in African politics. The idea of soldiers, trained to fight and defend, transforming into farmers working the land was both revolutionary and symbolic. It was a direct rejection of the old model of military dominance in Africa, where foreign powers often imposed their will on the continent through military force and political influence. Instead, Traoré chose to use the nation's military strength in a completely new direction, redirecting it away from conflict and toward creating long-term, sustainable food security for his people. This move was a statement to the world that Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, was ready to move away from foreign aid and begin developing self-sufficiency. The soldiers, who had once been trained to protect the country from external threats, were now tasked with a mission of survival, feeding the people and rebuilding the country from the ground up. This was not just a tactical move, it was an ideological shift that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Africa. The very idea of soldiers becoming farmers was a departure from the traditional Western model of military intervention in Africa. For decades, foreign powers and international organizations had used military bases, foreign aid, and military interventions as the primary tools to exert control over African nations. But now, with Traoré's revolutionary plan, Burkina Faso was rejecting that model. The transformation of these soldiers into farmers was not simply a temporary fix for the country's food crisis, it was a strategic and permanent shift toward national sovereignty and self-reliance. This move represented the beginning of an era in which Africa no longer had to rely on the charity of the West, but could stand tall as a self-sufficient and powerful force in its own right. By redirecting military resources toward agricultural production, Traoré was not only tackling the food insecurity that plagued his nation, but he was also creating a new blueprint for African development, one that is rooted in sustainability, local production, and sovereignty. The response from international media and global powers was mixed. Many saw this move as an innovative solution to a long-standing issue in Burkina Faso and across much of Africa. However, others, particularly former colonial powers, viewed it as a threat to their continued influence in the region. The Western world, which has long maintained military influence in Africa, was uncomfortable with the idea of African nations taking such bold steps toward independence and self-sufficiency. The idea that Burkina Faso, a small and historically unstable country, could survive without foreign military presence or international aid was unthinkable to many. But Traoré's strategy was clear: Africa's future would be shaped by Africans, not by foreign powers who had long been involved in Africa's struggles. While many countries in Africa rely on foreign aid to sustain their economies, Burkina Faso was rejecting this model entirely. The country was shifting its focus to agriculture, the backbone of its economy, and taking control of its resources to create sustainable growth. By investing in local production and redistributing the military to rebuild the country's agricultural sector, Traoré's government was ensuring that the nation's wealth would be invested in its own people, rather than being siphoned off by foreign interests. The move also highlighted an important aspect of Traoré's leadership: his commitment to ensuring that Burkina Faso, and by extension, Africa, could thrive without external influence. The decision to repurpose military resources to tackle food insecurity was a stark departure from the typical narrative of African nations relying on international interventions or foreign powers for their economic and social development. In fact, this approach was not just about food production, it was about empowerment, both for the people of Burkina Faso and for Africa as a whole. Traoré's leadership has become a symbol of Africa's ability to overcome challenges from within, without relying on external help. This idea of reclaiming sovereignty, reclaiming resources, and building an independent economy is a powerful one. And it is a vision that is beginning to inspire other African nations to rethink their own relationships with the West. The success of Burkina Faso's transformation from a nation that relied heavily on foreign aid to one that embraces self-sufficiency will inspire others to consider similar approaches to their own challenges. The bold decision to take control of the nation's resources, redirect military forces, and invest in local agriculture signals a new Africa, one that stands strong, independent, and self-reliant. In doing so, Senegal, Mali, Niger, and other African countries will likely follow suit, creating a ripple effect that will reshape the political and economic landscape of the continent. Burkina Faso's decision to send 8,000 soldiers to work the land is only the beginning of a much larger revolution in Africa, one that is centered on reclaiming its future, one farm at a time. The decision by Burkina Faso to redeploy its military forces to agriculture was revolutionary on many fronts. The country had long been plagued by food insecurity, with large portions of its population struggling to meet basic nutritional needs. Yet, when faced with the choice between continuing to depend on external aid or transforming its approach to self-reliance, President Ibrahim Traoré chose the latter. Instead of relying on foreign countries and international organizations for assistance, he looked inward. He saw that the key to the nation's survival wasn't just in defense and war but in the power of local production. The transformation of 8,000 trained soldiers into farmers was not only about addressing the immediate food crisis, it was a symbol of Africa's broader struggle for self-sufficiency and independence. The military, long seen as a tool of defense, was now being used to build a foundation for the country's future, rooted in agriculture and sustainable development. This shift was deeply symbolic of a growing desire across Africa to break free from the patterns of dependency that had been imposed upon it by foreign powers. For decades, many African nations had been trapped in a cycle of foreign aid, debt, and exploitation. In exchange for resources, labor, and land, African nations received aid that often came with strings attached, loans that could never be repaid, and political interference that undermined national sovereignty. But with Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso was charting a new course, one where the country's future was shaped by its own people. The decision to send the country's soldiers to the fields was not a quick fix. It required a complete rethinking of how the nation viewed its military and its role in national development. In many countries, military forces are trained to defend against foreign threats, protect borders, and maintain order. But in Burkina Faso, the military became a tool of reconstruction. These soldiers were no longer to be viewed as just defenders, they were to become builders of the nation's future, armed with plows instead of weapons. The military's transition to agriculture also had significant implications for the role of the government in national development. In a country where corruption and political instability had often undermined progress, the decision to empower the military for agricultural work was a direct challenge to the status quo. It was a message to the people of Burkina Faso that change was possible, that even the most entrenched systems could be reshaped for the benefit of the nation. The benefits of this transformation were immediately clear. With the military's involvement in farming, Burkina Faso's food production increased significantly. Crops that were once difficult to grow were now being cultivated in previously unused land. Communities that had long relied on foreign aid were now able to feed themselves and their families. This shift in mindset, from dependence to independence, was not only about feeding people, but it was about fostering a sense of self-reliance and dignity. The world's view of Africa has often been that of a continent in perpetual need, whether it's aid, foreign intervention, or loans. But Burkina Faso's decision to repurpose its military and focus on agriculture was a direct rebuttal of that narrative. It was a statement that Africa has the capacity to solve its own problems and that true development begins within the continent itself. Moreover, the economic implications of this move were far-reaching. Not only did it alleviate the immediate food crisis, but it also had long-term economic benefits. By increasing domestic food production, Burkina Faso was able to reduce its dependence on expensive imports. This meant more resources were available for reinvestment in other sectors of the economy, healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Traoré's strategy was a holistic one, addressing not just food security but the broader issues of economic sustainability. The ripple effects of this move were felt across West Africa. Other countries began to take notice, especially those that had also struggled with food insecurity and reliance on external aid. The success of Burkina Faso's agricultural shift inspired neighboring nations to explore similar strategies, with several even following suit and redeploying parts of their military to assist with farming efforts. The African Union, which has often struggled with Pan-African unity, started taking steps to coordinate efforts between countries to increase agricultural productivity across the continent. Senegal, Mali, and other neighboring countries were starting to view Burkina Faso not just as an ally but as a beacon for a new vision of African independence, one that emphasized self-sufficiency, empowerment, and sustainable development. However, the challenges ahead were still significant. Despite the early success, Burkina Faso still faces considerable issues. The country's infrastructure is underdeveloped, and despite the gains in food production, the economy remains fragile. Political instability, corruption, and climate change continue to pose serious threats to the country's progress. But what sets Burkina Faso apart is the unwavering belief in its own potential. The people of Burkina Faso, led by President Traoré, are not relying on the benevolence of foreign powers. They are building their future from within. The challenge is immense, but as the success of their agricultural revolution shows, the people of Burkina Faso are determined to rise above their past struggles and pave the way for a brighter future. On July 1, 2025, a momentous shift occurred in Burkina Faso that would change the way the world viewed both the nation and its future. President Ibrahim Traoré, in a historic and unexpected move, ordered that 8,000 trained soldiers, who had once defended the country's borders, be redeployed to the nation's farmlands. These soldiers, who had been on the front lines of Burkina Faso's many battles, were now to become the country's primary workforce in an effort to combat the severe food insecurity plaguing the nation. This move, which was initially met with skepticism, quickly became one of the most talked about events in African politics. The idea of soldiers, trained to fight and defend, transforming into farmers working the land was both revolutionary and symbolic. It was a direct rejection of the old model of military dominance in Africa, where foreign powers often imposed their will on the continent through military force and political influence. Instead, Traoré chose to use the nation's military strength in a completely new direction, redirecting it away from conflict and toward creating long-term, sustainable food security for his people. This move was a statement to the world that Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, was ready to move away from foreign aid and begin developing self-sufficiency. The soldiers, who had once been trained to protect the country from external threats, were now tasked with a mission of survival, feeding the people and rebuilding the country from the ground up. This was not just a tactical move, it was an ideological shift that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Africa. The very idea of soldiers becoming farmers was a departure from the traditional Western model of military intervention in Africa. For decades, foreign powers and international organizations had used military bases, foreign aid, and military interventions as the primary tools to exert control over African nations. But now, with Traoré's revolutionary plan, Burkina Faso was rejecting that model. The transformation of these soldiers into farmers was not simply a temporary fix for the country's food crisis, it was a strategic and permanent shift toward national sovereignty and self-reliance. This move represented the beginning of an era in which Africa no longer had to rely on the charity of the West, but could stand tall as a self-sufficient and powerful force in its own right. By redirecting military resources toward agricultural production, Traoré was not only tackling the food insecurity that plagued his nation, but he was also creating a new blueprint for African development, one that is rooted in sustainability, local production, and sovereignty. The response from international media and global powers was mixed. Many saw this move as an innovative solution to a long-standing issue in Burkina Faso and across much of Africa. However, others, particularly former colonial powers, viewed it as a threat to their continued influence in the region. The Western world, which has long maintained military influence in Africa, was uncomfortable with the idea of African nations taking such bold steps toward independence and self-sufficiency. The idea that Burkina Faso, a small and historically unstable country, could survive without foreign military presence or international aid was unthinkable to many. But Traoré's strategy was clear: Africa's future would be shaped by Africans, not by foreign powers who had long been involved in Africa's struggles. While many countries in Africa rely on foreign aid to sustain their economies, Burkina Faso was rejecting this model entirely. The country was shifting its focus to agriculture, the backbone of its economy, and taking control of its resources to create sustainable growth. By investing in local production and redistributing the military to rebuild the country's agricultural sector, Traoré's government was ensuring that the nation's wealth would be invested in its own people, rather than being siphoned off by foreign interests. The move also highlighted an important aspect of Traoré's leadership: his commitment to ensuring that Burkina Faso, and by extension, Africa, could thrive without external influence. The decision to repurpose military resources to tackle food insecurity was a stark departure from the typical narrative of African nations relying on international interventions or foreign powers for their economic and social development. In fact, this approach was not just about food production, it was about empowerment, both for the people of Burkina Faso and for Africa as a whole. Traoré's leadership has become a symbol of Africa's ability to overcome challenges from within, without relying on external help. This idea of reclaiming sovereignty, reclaiming resources, and building an independent economy is a powerful one. And it is a vision that is beginning to inspire other African nations to rethink their own relationships with the West. The success of Burkina Faso's transformation from a nation that relied heavily on foreign aid to one that embraces self-sufficiency will inspire others to consider similar approaches to their own challenges. The bold decision to take control of the nation's resources, redirect military forces, and invest in local agriculture signals a new Africa, one that stands strong, independent, and self-reliant. In doing so, Senegal, Mali, Niger, and other African countries will likely follow suit, creating a ripple effect that will reshape the political and economic landscape of the continent. Burkina Faso's decision to send 8,000 soldiers to work the land is only the beginning of a much larger revolution in Africa, one that is centered on reclaiming its future, one farm at a time. Burkina Faso's transformation under President Ibrahim Traoré is shaking the foundations of the global order. As the country asserts its sovereignty and becomes a beacon for African independence, the ripple effects of this movement are being felt across the continent and around the world. Africa's rise is no longer an abstract concept, it is a tangible reality, and Burkina Faso is at the forefront of this shift. What began as a localized effort to combat food insecurity by repurposing soldiers into farmers has now become a global statement of defiance and empowerment. As Burkina Faso's economy grows, more African nations are looking to follow suit, taking control of their resources and building self-reliant, sustainable economies. The political, economic, and social implications of this movement cannot be overstated. Burkina Faso's bold decision to remove foreign military presence and focus on local agriculture has set off a series of events that are challenging the global power dynamics. The West, particularly France, which has long maintained military and economic influence over former African colonies, is now grappling with the reality that Africa is no longer content to remain under its control. The global narrative surrounding Africa is shifting. For decades, the continent has been portrayed as dependent on foreign aid and external intervention. But now, African nations are asserting that they do not need to rely on foreign powers to thrive. The success of Burkina Faso's agricultural initiative, alongside similar efforts in Mali, Niger, and other countries, is challenging the idea that Africa needs Western assistance to succeed. Instead, African nations are proving that they can build their own future, driven by their own resources and people. The question for the West is no longer whether Africa will rise, it is how quickly Africa will rise and how the West will respond. As more African nations begin to reject foreign intervention and assert their sovereignty, the global order will need to adapt. No longer will African nations be treated as passive recipients of aid and foreign military presence. They are now taking their place as equals on the global stage. But the challenge is not just about military presence or food security, it's about reclaiming Africa's resources. For too long, Africa's wealth has been extracted by foreign corporations with little benefit to the African people. Senegal, Mali, and Burkina Faso are beginning to take control of their natural resources, ensuring that these resources are used to benefit their people, not multinational corporations. This move toward economic independence is not just about national pride, it is about creating sustainable, long-term growth. By taking control of its resources and redirecting the focus from foreign aid to local production, Burkina Faso is building an economy that will not only serve the people but also position the country as an emerging economic power on the continent. This new economic model is already having an impact on neighboring countries. The ripple effect of Burkina Faso's success is being felt across West Africa. Nations like Guinea, Mali, and Niger are looking to Burkina Faso as a model for economic self-sufficiency and sovereignty. The shift toward African-led development is gaining momentum, and the West is struggling to keep up. For too long, Western powers, including France, have been involved in the economic and political affairs of African countries, often with little regard for the needs of the people. But now, Burkina Faso's defiance is proving that Africa can stand on its own, without the help of foreign powers. This transformation is not without resistance, of course. The West is not simply going to relinquish its grip on Africa's resources and political systems without a fight. But the growing strength of the African self-sufficiency movement is undeniable. The success of Burkina Faso in creating a self-reliant economy, fueled by local production and resource control, is providing a blueprint for other nations to follow. As more countries embrace this model of independence and sovereignty, the global power structures will continue to shift. Africa's rise is inevitable, and as the continent becomes more united, self-sufficient, and economically independent, the West will have no choice but to adapt. The future of Africa is in its hands, and the rest of the world must recognize this shift. No longer will Africa be seen as a continent in need of aid or intervention, it is a continent that will shape its own future, build its own economy, and create a more equal relationship with the rest of the world. Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, and other nations are leading the way, but they are not alone. The rise of Africa is a collective movement, and as more countries join the fight for sovereignty, the continent will grow stronger and more influential. The world will have to adapt to this new reality. Africa is rising, and it is ready to take its place as a global leader. As the wave of change sweeps across Africa, Senegal's leadership, alongside Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is becoming the driving force behind a new continent-wide identity, one that is centered on unity, self-reliance, and strength. The success of Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation, where 8,000 soldiers were redeployed to the farms to fight hunger, is not just a solution to food insecurity, it is a symbol of Africa's reclaiming its power. By embracing local production and rejecting foreign dependency, these nations are showing the world that Africa's future will be built by Africans. For too long, Africa has been viewed through the lens of poverty, instability, and need. The colonial mindset, which portrayed the continent as one in perpetual struggle, has long been used to justify foreign intervention, both militarily and economically. But the actions of Senegal, Burkina Faso, and others are rejecting this narrative. Africa is not the helpless continent it has been made out to be. These countries are creating a new vision of Africa, one that can not only defend itself but thrive on its own terms. The rise of these nations is changing how the world sees Africa. Burkina Faso's strategic decision to redirect military resources toward agriculture, combined with their efforts to reclaim national sovereignty and control over resources, is showing that Africa's future is in its own hands. This movement, led by a new generation of leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré, represents Africa's ultimate rejection of colonialism and foreign interference. It is a turning point for a continent that has long been viewed as a pawn in global geopolitics. The implications of this shift are enormous. Other African nations are beginning to follow suit. Countries like Mali, Niger, and Guinea are already taking bold steps toward economic and political independence, choosing to invest in local production and reduce reliance on foreign military and economic aid. This growing movement is not just about individual countries, it is about Pan-African unity. The rise of an economically self-sufficient Africa, where resources are controlled by Africans and invested in their people, will ensure the continent can tackle its own challenges. The ripple effects of Burkina Faso's leadership are already being felt across the continent. African nations are increasingly looking at how they can build their own future, using local resources, local manpower, and local expertise to create jobs, grow industries, and provide sustainable development. The African Union, AU, which has long struggled to unite the continent, is starting to take on a more central role in this new vision of Africa. With more nations asserting their sovereignty, it is becoming clear that Africa's future is no longer in the hands of foreign powers. As Africa works toward greater unity, self-sufficiency, and economic independence, the AU has the potential to become the organization that coordinates these efforts and ensures the continent's collective growth. But even as this movement gains momentum, challenges remain. Political instability, corruption, and external pressures are still obstacles that need to be overcome. The forces that have historically controlled Africa, particularly Western powers, will not relinquish their hold easily. As African nations reject foreign influence, there will be resistance, especially from the nations and corporations that stand to lose from this newfound independence. But the strength and resolve shown by Burkina Faso, Senegal, and others prove that Africa is ready to face these challenges head-on. The ultimate goal for Africa is not just independence from foreign intervention but the creation of a united, prosperous future where African nations work together for the collective good. The creation of a strong, self-sufficient economy is the foundation on which this future will be built. As Burkina Faso leads the way, it is proving that it is possible to build a sustainable, independent economy that benefits the people, not foreign corporations. This shift from dependency to self-reliance is the key to Africa's long-term success. The rest of the world is now watching closely as the African continent begins to define its own future. The West, which has long controlled much of Africa's destiny through economic, political, and military means, is being forced to acknowledge that Africa's time has come. The old model of Africa's dependence on foreign powers is no longer sustainable. Africa is ready to take its place in the world as a leader, not a follower. This movement, sparked by Senegal and Burkina Faso, is not just about rejecting the past, it's about creating a new, vibrant future. A future where Africa's voice is heard loud and clear, its sovereignty respected, and its nations united in the pursuit of a prosperous and self-sufficient future. The bold actions of Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not just individual successes, they represent the beginning of a broader movement toward African unity and self-reliance. For decades, Africa has been fragmented, divided by colonial borders, and often caught in the political and economic struggle for survival under the influence of foreign powers. But now, African nations are coming together, asserting their sovereignty, and building a future where they can rely on their own resources and people, not external aid or intervention. The concept of unity has long been discussed in Africa, but the events of 2025, led by the likes of Ibrahim Traoré, are proving that it's not just a dream, it's becoming a reality. Unity is the foundation of the future Africa is striving for, and as more nations reject foreign military presence and focus on internal development, the prospects for Pan-African solidarity are brighter than ever. Senegal's bold decision to expel French forces and take control of its military base was a crucial turning point, but it is only one step in the larger process of building an Africa that is free from foreign control and intervention. With economic sovereignty at the heart of this shift, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are setting examples that are resonating across the continent. The idea of Africa standing up for its resources, its future, and its people is not just a political movement, it is a revolution in the making. As Ibrahim Traoré and other leaders redefine the narrative of African leadership, a new sense of pride and unity is emerging that has the potential to reshape the continent's future. The unity that is forming in West Africa is a powerful symbol of what is possible when African nations work together. Unity in Africa doesn't just mean political agreements or joint policies, it means taking collective action to protect sovereignty, defend resources, and build an economy that serves the people. Africa's strength lies in its ability to unite and collaborate across borders, forging new partnerships and relationships within the continent. The success of Senegal, Burkina Faso, and other nations has shown that self-reliance and independence are not only achievable but necessary for Africa's growth. By investing in local resources, local economies, and local talent, Africa can break free from dependency and develop its own path to prosperity. The transition from foreign aid and intervention to self-sufficiency will ensure that the continent is not reliant on the goodwill of foreign powers to determine its future. This economic independence is the driving force behind the shift toward a united Africa. As more African nations adopt this model of sovereignty, Africa will no longer be seen as a resource to be exploited or a burden to be supported. Instead, it will be viewed as a global power, united, self-reliant, and in control of its own destiny. The growth of African unity is not only an economic necessity but a cultural transformation. For too long, Africa has been told that it cannot stand on its own, that it needs foreign intervention to survive. But the actions of Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are showing the world that Africa is more than capable of thriving without foreign influence. The message is clear: Africa will no longer be a passive participant in global affairs. It will be a continent that shapes its own future, builds its own industries, and controls its own resources. The unity of African nations is key to achieving this. The rise of the African Union, AU, as a more unified and powerful institution is crucial in supporting the movement for sovereignty and economic independence. As more nations join this movement, the AU's role in facilitating Pan-African unity will become even more important. The AU will need to play a leading role in supporting policies that promote economic independence, self-reliance, and regional cooperation. The more African nations come together, the stronger the continent will become. Africa's future is in its own hands. The success of Senegal and its allies is proof that Africa can not only defend itself but can build its future on its own terms. As African nations collaborate, share resources, and work together toward a common goal, the continent's influence will continue to grow. The rise of Africa is not just about the continent asserting its independence from foreign powers, it is about creating an Africa that is united, self-sufficient, and ready to lead. The time has come for Africa to take its rightful place in the world, and as nations join the movement toward sovereignty, the vision of African unity will become a reality. The world will have no choice but to recognize the rise of Africa as a global force, one that is rooted in strength, unity, and self-determination. As Africa's nations rise to take control of their own futures, the shift in global power dynamics is becoming increasingly apparent. The actions of Burkina Faso, Senegal, Mali, and Niger have ignited a revolution of self-determination, and the world can no longer ignore the power Africa is beginning to wield. The days of Africa being seen as a dependent continent, needing foreign intervention and aid, are over. What began as a regional movement for sovereignty is now quickly becoming a global force, reshaping the world's political, economic, and cultural landscape. Africa's rise is not just a challenge to the West's historic dominance, it's a reshaping of the global order itself. The rise of African nations like Senegal, which boldly expelled French military forces, is a symbolic breaking of chains that have long held the continent in the grip of foreign powers. For too long, the West's economic and military presence in Africa has been justified by claims of regional security or humanitarian aid. These narratives are being dismantled as African nations like Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Mali assert that their security and prosperity do not rely on foreign powers. They are proving that Africa is capable of determining its own future without the constant presence of Western troops or foreign assistance. This defiance against Western imperialism and intervention is changing the way Africa is seen in global politics. As African nations take control of their own resources, manage their own economies, and work together for collective prosperity, they are no longer just passive participants in the global economic system. They are active players shaping their own future. The economic implications of Africa's rise are profound. As more nations like Burkina Faso and Mali reject foreign economic dominance and control, Africa is starting to leverage its vast natural resources in ways that benefit its own people. The potential for African nations to harness their wealth for local growth, infrastructure, and job creation is enormous. The shift from dependency to self-sufficiency will not only create jobs and wealth within Africa but will also give rise to new economic powerhouses on the global stage. Countries like Senegal, with its growing agricultural and mining sectors, are leading the way in sustainable development that benefits local communities. As these nations gain greater control over their resources and economies, the global market will need to adapt to Africa's new role as a major player. This new economic strength will give African nations leverage in global trade and diplomacy. As African nations unite, their collective influence will challenge the dominance of Western powers, particularly those that have long depended on Africa's resources. The political implications are just as significant. Africa is no longer a passive recipient of foreign political influence. African countries are increasingly taking control of their own destinies, working together to protect their sovereignty and build a more unified and strong continent. The shift away from foreign interference in Africa's politics is also a rejection of the outdated colonial power dynamics that have long existed. Africa is rising to challenge these systems, and as more nations reject foreign dominance, the African Union (AU) is poised to play a larger role in coordinating efforts for Pan-African solidarity. The AU's growing influence will be crucial as African nations continue to work together to ensure their political, economic, and social futures are in their own hands. But this shift is not without resistance. Western powers, particularly France and the United States, are uncomfortable with this newfound African autonomy. The West has long used Africa as a resource, both economically and militarily, and the rise of African self-reliance challenges the status quo. France's reliance on African resources and military bases has been integral to its global power, and the rejection of French military presence in countries like Burkina Faso and Mali is forcing France to re-evaluate its strategies in Africa. But Africa's rise is inevitable. The continent is no longer content with being a passive participant in global affairs. The countries leading this movement, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Mali, and Niger, are already rewriting the rules of engagement. As more nations join this movement for sovereignty, Africa's collective strength will only grow. This is not just a political movement, it is a movement of empowerment, one that is transforming Africa from a continent of exploitation to a continent of independence, unity, and strength. The global shift in power will have lasting effects on the political and economic structures of the world. As African nations continue to assert their sovereignty, the global balance of power will no longer be determined by Western interests. Africa's influence will shape the future, and the world will have to adapt to this new reality. The rise of Africa is unstoppable. As African nations unite, assert their sovereignty, and reclaim their resources, they will create a future of prosperity, peace, and power. The world will have to recognize the new face of Africa, and Africa's time has finally arrived. As the world adjusts to the new reality of a rising Africa, the journey toward sovereignty and unity is far from over. The bold actions of Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have already set the stage for a more independent, self-sufficient Africa. But this is just the beginning. The continent's path to true sovereignty, economic growth, and political unity is one that will define its future for generations to come. The time has come for Africa to step forward as a global leader, no longer relying on the West for guidance, military presence, or economic aid. The successful reclaiming of military bases, the assertion of political independence, and the push for economic self-reliance are all part of a broader movement that will define Africa's place in the 21st century. Senegal's leadership, especially its decision to expel French military forces and take control of critical infrastructure, symbolizes a larger political renaissance. The country has proven that African nations can shape their own futures, charting a course that is not dictated by former colonial powers. As other African nations observe Senegal's success, the idea of reclaiming sovereignty is gaining traction across the continent. The African Union (AU) has a critical role to play in this process. As the political arm of Pan-Africanism, the AU will have to evolve to become a more cohesive and powerful force. With increasing calls for self-determination across the continent, the AU must become the institution that unites African nations, helping them navigate the challenges of independence while working together to ensure prosperity for all. The shift from aid dependency to self-reliance is central to Africa's future success. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are already on the path to reducing their reliance on foreign powers and embracing sustainable development practices. The economic model they are creating, focused on local production, job creation, and resource control, is showing the world that Africa has the capacity to thrive on its own terms. This shift, however, will take time. Overcoming years of colonial exploitation and foreign control will not be easy, but the resilience and determination displayed by these nations show that Africa is ready to take on the challenge. As these nations come together and build stronger ties of economic cooperation, Africa's place in the global economy will be forever changed. The Western model of exploitation will give way to one where African nations work together for the collective good, leveraging their resources for the benefit of their people, not foreign corporations. The success of Senegal and its allies is a testament to what is possible when African nations take charge of their own futures. But the challenges remain. Resistance from former colonial powers, economic challenges, and political instability are obstacles that must be addressed. The West is likely to continue its efforts to maintain its influence in Africa through diplomacy, trade deals, and media manipulation. However, Africa's resolve is growing stronger. The unity that is being built across the continent is not just about rejecting foreign influence, it is about creating a new vision for the future. A vision where Africa is in control of its own destiny and where its nations stand together in mutual respect, cooperation, and self-sufficiency. The African people, empowered by this vision, will no longer accept being passive players on the world stage. The global power dynamics are shifting, and Africa is ready to claim its rightful place in the world. As African nations unite, they will have the strength and influence to determine their own path. The rise of Africa is unstoppable, and the world will soon have no choice but to recognize its growing influence. With a unified and self-sufficient Africa, the continent will not just survive but thrive, shaping its own future and the future of the world. The journey has only just begun, and as more nations join this movement for sovereignty, the African continent will rise to new heights. Africa's time has come. This is not just about political and economic sovereignty, it's about pride, unity, and empowerment. The revolution is here, and Africa is leading it. As Africa rises to claim its future, the world is forced to acknowledge the shifting power dynamics. The bold leadership of nations like Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger has set in motion a movement that will forever change the continent's destiny. These countries are not just rejecting the dominance of foreign powers, they are paving the way for a new African renaissance, one that is rooted in sovereignty, unity, and economic independence. The ripple effects of their actions are reverberating across the entire continent. What started as a handful of nations asserting their autonomy is now becoming a continent-wide movement toward self-reliance, sustainable development, and a future where Africa controls its own destiny. No longer will Africa be a passive recipient of foreign aid, military intervention, and external influence. Africa is taking charge, and the world must adapt. The significance of Senegal's decision to expel French forces and Burkina Faso's move to repurpose its military forces toward agriculture are not isolated incidents, they are the beginning of a profound transformation. Other African nations are already following suit, and the call for Pan-African unity and independence is growing louder every day. The African Union, AU, once seen as a fragmented and ineffective institution, is evolving into a stronger body that can represent the collective will of the people. With its leadership embracing self-determination, the AU is becoming a key player in guiding Africa toward a future where it is economically powerful, politically stable, and socially united. The foundation for a new Africa is being built, and the age of foreign influence is coming to an end. Senegal, Burkina Faso, and their allies are showing the world that Africa's future will be shaped by Africans themselves, not by foreign governments, multinational corporations, or international organizations that have historically profited off Africa's wealth. This is a defining moment in African history, and it is just the beginning. The success of these countries, in reclaiming their resources and asserting their independence, proves that Africa is capable of thriving without the need for Western aid or intervention. These nations are demonstrating that self-sufficiency and economic independence are not just ideals, they are achievable goals. And as more African nations adopt this new approach, the continent will become an even more formidable force in global affairs. The rise of Africa is inevitable, and as the continent continues to grow in strength and unity, the old power structures will no longer hold sway. Africa is no longer a passive participant in global politics and economics, it is a leader in shaping the future of the world. The transformation we are witnessing today will not only elevate Africa but will also change the global landscape for generations to come. Africa is not just rising, it is reclaiming its place as a central force in global governance, trade, and politics. The West may resist, but the momentum is clear. The global balance of power is shifting, and Africa's role will only become more prominent as the continent's nations unite. Africa is finally breaking free, and with every step, it moves closer to a future where it can dictate its own terms, control its own resources, and create its own path to prosperity. This is the dawn of a new era, where Africa is no longer at the mercy of foreign powers but is leading the way to a brighter, more independent future. The question is not if Africa will rise, but how fast and how far it will go. With each nation that joins the movement for sovereignty, Africa's time has come, and the world will have no choice but to adapt to this unstoppable force. Africa is rising, and it is ready to lead the world.